Hey guys, I hope I am joined today by people from Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, because I am wrapping up a week of Remembrance Day videos. Today is Friday. It is November 11th, so it is Remembrance Day. It is also Veterans Day for us here in the United States. And I'm doing a special. I'm not just going to react to one video. I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between Veterans Day and Remembrance Day and why they're different, how they diverged from each other, and go into a little bit of the history and how these days are celebrated isn't really the right word, observed in our respective countries. So I hope that you enjoy this video. I hope that you will like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you're so inclined. And let's get to it, my friends. So as you can see behind me and here, the poppy flower is a powerful symbol of remembrance. And the first video that we're going to look at, it's short, relatively short, just under 10 minutes, is from the Imperial War Museum's The History of Remembrance Day Poppies. So let's get to that.
In 2014, 800,000 ceramic poppies designed by Paul Cummings and Tom Piper went on display at the Tower of London. Two parts of this installation later went on tour around the UK to 19 different locations before ending up at IWM London in 2018. Nearly 10 million people saw this display in total. This year, the poppy sculptures are being installed at IWM North. These evocative displays demonstrate the resounding popularity of the poppy over 100 years since the end of the First World War.
Gorgeous.
So what is it about the poppy that captured the public imagination so profoundly? Why do some people see the poppy as a controversial symbol? And how was the poppy chosen in the first place?
So the red poppy has arguably become the most enduring symbol of remembrance. And really that is linked to, I suppose, what we could call a botanical phenomenon, because poppies provided this kind of shocking burst of plant life in very otherwise bleak landscapes on the Western Front. And that really was helped along, actually, by the fact that modern weaponry, particularly artillery, basically pulverized the soil, and high explosive shells actually had quite a surprisingly generative effect. They basically created the perfect conditions in which the red poppy could grow. And they were everywhere. There was a huge profusion of them on the Western Front. So they would have been something that soldiers saw very commonly.
And they think about the dichotomy there too. You know, this beautiful example of life finds a way to grow with all that death. I'm sure they're going to be speaking about the, of course, the famous poem In Flanders Fields.
Right in thinking that area would have had a lot of poppies.
It was very poor agricultural land all the way along. And I can remember the fields more or less red with poppies than anything else. Very poverty, very poor.
So do you think the poppy is a good symbol?
Oh, I do, yes, it is a very good symbol, yes.
Because they grew so commonly, many soldiers not only enjoyed looking at them, but lots of soldiers actually plucked them out of the soil and took the fragile petals to press into letters home. And I think for soldiers, although we think of the poppy as being quite a depressing thing in some ways because we associate it with the lives lost, at the time, many soldiers felt that they were a really beautiful sight. IWM actually has quite a number of examples of these poppies in our collection, and they're an incredible thing to look at.
It's dried out and still existing. Cool.
100 years later.
Tangible piece of history right there.
Poppy. All over this place, those poppies had sprung up, and they were so talked about, regarded as symbolic in a way.
It's a gorgeous painting.
I thought I'd pick a few and send them home. So I
wonder if a soldier painted that.
I did that. I sent them to Jessamine, but when she died, there was found among her belongings the envelope in which I had sent home those poppies, with the remainder of the poppies still there.
Among the millions of people who saw the poppies on the Western Front was a Canadian doctor called Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. He was a medic in a dressing station very close to the front line near Ypres. John McCrae wasn't an established writer, but he had had poems published back in Canada, and as a military doctor, he used what rest time he had to write poems in response to what he was experiencing during the war.
In May 1915, during a break from tending to wounded and dying soldiers, he wrote a new poem, and it's a poem commonly known as In Flanders Fields. And it has its setting as a cemetery, and it's written as if it were being spoken by dead soldiers. And this poem did become popular during the war. It was published in a hugely popular magazine. It helped to, I suppose, connect the symbolism of death during the war with the poppy. And McCrae himself did not actually survive the war, but it was really after the war that the poppy became.
Oh, I didn't know that. He didn't survive the war? Oh, that's sad. That's sad. Yeah, I mean, of course, this poem is probably the biggest reason why the poppy became the symbol of remembrance. But it was fostered after the war by a couple of people, and I know one of them is actually an American, and let's see if they cover that.
The iconic symbol of remembrance that it is today.
In 1920, there were numerous acts of remembrance across Britain, such as 2-minute silence, the burial of the unknown warrior, and the unveiling of the cenotaph in London. But at this point, we can see that the poppy was not yet the flower of remembrance that we think of it as today.
If you look at photos from, say, that unveiling of the cenotaph, the reeds that are laid around its base were actually not of poppies. You can see, even though the photos are black and white, you can see quite clearly that there are other flowers, and the poppy isn't as established and had not taken hold as it's known today.
The poppy's status as a recognisable symbol of remembrance.
Just out of curiosity, where does the cenotaph get its name from? What is the meaning of that?
And its use as a fundraising tool began after the war, and this was primarily driven by the work of 2 different women.
One of those women was an American academic called Mona Michael.
That's what I was talking about.
She had been inspired by John
Driven by the work of 2 different women.
One of those women was an American academic called Mona Michael. She had been inspired by John McCrae's poem just before the armistice. She described in her memoirs reading the poem and having a very intense kind of spiritual experience. And she was moved to buy artificial flowers to distribute them for wearing as on people's lapels as a symbol of remembrance. There was also another woman called Anna Guerin. She had very well established in the sense of setting up a network of French war widows who made artificial flowers made from silk to raise funds for various causes.
Anna Goering was christened the Poppy Lady from France, and by 1920 her work had resulted in the American Legion and the Major Veterans Association in the USA adopting the poppy as a symbol of remembrance. After this success, Goering then turned her attention to Britain.
In the immediate
And I think she invited representatives from the American Legion to come to Europe to help foster this idea of the poppy as the symbol, but also a means by which you could fundraise for
the First World War.
Veterans.
There were many veterans associations set up, and some of these associations were brought together under the umbrella of a new organisation called the British Legion, which had just been formed by the time in August 1921 when Anna Guerin came to Britain to meet with the British Legion and to basically persuade them to adopt selling artificial poppies. She was backed, and the British Legion's figurehead was Earl Haig. And so the first ever Poppy Day was arranged and established in Britain, held on 11th of November 1921.
After the first appeal, it was clear that there was a huge appetite for the remembrance poppy in Britain. Volunteers were rallied across the country, and the appeal was so popular that sellers couldn't keep up with the demand.
So the idea perpetuated itself in future years, and in order to make sure that there was an adequate supply of poppies, the British Legion decided to set up its own poppy factory, employing wounded servicemen to make artificial poppies.
The symbol of the poppy is more popular and well established than it's ever been. But for some people, the poppy is seen as a contentious symbol.
It has now come to symbolise the...
So she's about to say it. I'm gonna guess, because I watch English Premier League football, and I do know that there have been some footballers who have come under controversy for not wearing the poppy, and they have various reasons for it. You know, I know one is somebody from Northern Ireland, and because of the, you know, obviously the political reasons, and we don't necessarily need to go into them. I think you all understand just by mentioning that this person is from Northern Ireland, why he might view the poppy as sort of a symbol of British militarism or military.
Sacrifice and the efforts of the armed forces in more recent conflicts. But because these more recent conflicts have become more complex and perhaps less morally ambiguous to some people, and therefore not as well supported as broadly the world wars were, the poppy has become a more contentious symbol. This primarily manifests itself in alternative poppies. For example, the white poppy is the most familiar, a symbol of peace, anti-war, set up by the Peace Pledge Union in the 1930s to challenge militarism.
You know, listen, I don't want to I don't want to step into controversy on Remembrance Day, but this is an interesting bit of information. My own viewpoint, my own opinion is I understand where they're coming from, but this is whether it's red or white, it's a symbol of remembrance of those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We don't have to judge the propriety of war. We don't have to glorify war. All we're doing is remembering.
It's also seen in controversies over the red poppy being appropriated by, for example, far-right organisations, and the objection that some people have to wearing it because they see it as being connected to the actions of Britain's army, for example, in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, which they found very difficult. But in conclusion, the poppy is still worn by millions of people every Remembrance Day and into the November season, when we see poppies all around us on people's lapels, in wreaths, at war memorials. And over 100 years later, it has also inspired artwork like that which we saw at the Tower of London in 2014. Its literal and symbolic seeds were rooted in the First World War's turbulent landscape. And it's really interesting to remember the poppy then as a symbol of hope, of a morale boost, as a burst of colour in very bleak landscapes during the First World War.
A symbol of life thriving
Today,
in a landscape of death.
Still worn by millions of people across the UK and the Commonwealth every year. It continues to be a vital fundraising tool for the British Legion charity and an important remembrance symbol in artworks, tributes and commemorative events.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching.
Well, my friends, okay, so we're going to move on from there to a video about how Remembrance Day is observed in Canada.
What is Remembrance Day? Remembrance Day is a day where we take some time out of our busy lives to reflect on those who went before us and paid the ultimate sacrifice. My name is Major Rick Cameron. I'm the Deputy Military Advisor here at Canada's Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York. Remembrance Day is a day of reflection. It was originally introduced just after the First World War. At that time it was called Armistice Day, in commemoration of the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. Armistice Day signified the end of the First World War, and it was to take effect the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which is why we celebrate it or commemorate it on 11th of November every year. And at 11 o'clock, it is signified by 2 minutes of silence, right as the clock strikes 11.
Knowing that today, at precisely 11, I'm off today. Many businesses close for Veterans Day. Not everybody does, but my office does. And so at 11 a.m. this morning, I did do my moment of silence with specific thoughts to certain soldiers I have known throughout my life that are no longer with us.
The devastation on the Western Front was basically total annihilation by artillery fire. It decimated everything. Houses, trees, everything was gone. But shortly after the bombardments ceased, the poppy was the first symbol of growth, of rebirth. And it was very prevalent because the soil conditions in Flanders were such that the poppy flourished. So there would be vast fields of nothing but red poppies. The poppy was originally introduced by a poem that was written by a Canadian medic during the First World War by the name of Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. After a significant battle in Flanders, he penned the poem In Flanders Fields. The significance of the poppy was highlighted during that poem, and ever since it has been adopted as the flower of remembrance. In the US, you have Veterans Day, which is also commemorated on the 11th of November. You also have Memorial Day. So in the Commonwealth countries, those are kind of all combined into Remembrance Day. It's very highly regarded in the Canadian psyche. Personally, I see Remembrance Day as a period of reflection. I reflect on friends and colleagues who were lost in the Afghanistan war. I also reflect on previous generations of soldiers who went before me to help forge a path for my career. I think Remembrance Day is very important to commemorate and to continue commemorating in the future. The intent behind Remembrance Day is not to glorify war. It's to reflect upon those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. And each year, Canada and other Commonwealth countries use this time of remembrance. And the theme for Remembrance Day is Lest We Forget. We need to remember what happened in the past so we don't revert to those ways in the future.
Very well said, my friend. Very well said. Okay, I very much enjoyed both of those videos. Some of them touched on similar themes about why the poppy has been adopted. The British Museum one went into a little bit more detail, but the Canadian video went into a little bit more of what Remembrance Day is and how it is observed today, that it is a very solemn day, that it is a day of reflection. And that leads me into things that they both said that relate to the United States and our shared history. It's not a coincidence that Veterans Day is today, November 11th, and it doesn't change. It's not on, the fourth Monday of a month or something like that. So they mentioned that after World War I, the 11th of November was referred to as Armistice Day, and it was here as well. It was virtually the same holiday that you celebrate now. And in fact, the tomb of the unknown soldier, and I know in the first video we watched, they mentioned the unknown warrior. France did something similar. A lot of the nations that had fought commemorated unknown warriors and unknown soldiers. The tomb of the unknown soldier was the first person being interred there was a World War I unknown soldier. And on Armistice Day, the president would bring a wreath of remembrance and with the inscription, Lest We Forget. Very similar to what I believe the monarch in Britain does at the cenotaph. And it seems there was some form of monument there in the Canadian video. And, I would love to know what that was specifically because I don't. And it seems that it was similarly celebrated in the Commonwealth as well as in the United States. Why did that change here? There's a good reason for it. Because we had already a day that was not an official holiday, that was celebrated, or rather, I keep using that word and it's not the right word, observed, called Decoration Day. And this harkens back to the Civil War. Now, of course, the people in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, in their minds and memories, the First World War was fresh. And all of the soldiers that died during the First World War still had family members, still had, children and wives and brothers and sisters and parents living. And so Armistice Day was really more important than this unofficial day that had been going on for since the end of the Civil War, where soldiers on both sides got together to honor the dead by decorating their tombstones. They would put flowers, they would put wreaths, they would decorate them with flags. And eventually, after the Korean War, you know, and of course World War II had happened. Now there's two other wars that had happened besides World War I, and it was still being called Armistice Day. So Dwight Eisenhower, who was Supreme Allied Commander in the European theater in World War II, was the President of the United States, and he made it an official national holiday for all of the veterans and the dead of the wars that had come between, and wanted it also to be for the living, for the veterans. And so he made it an official holiday. Now, when I was a little kid, my grandmother, who had a older brother, much older brother, she was World War II generation, but her oldest brother fought in World War I in France in 1918, and she still called it Armistice Day. I think she did until her death in 1999. So, you know, she never shook the difference of what that holiday was and had meant to her for decades before it changed. And one of the reasons why it changed was because we had this other holiday out there that was about, you know, memorialization and remembrance of the war dead only. And it was a relatively simple way to deal with it, which was decorations of graves. And as war monuments began to be erected after the Civil War and after World War I and World War II, people decorate war monuments as well. And so we had these kind of competing days that sort of served similar interests. One born out of World War I, just like yours, and was celebrated just like yours. One born out of the Civil War that was unofficial, that was just always there. And so eventually, by as late as the 1970s, Memorial Day was finally made a national holiday. And I think originally it was put at the 31st of May, because it was always a May springtime thing. And it eventually was changed to the last Monday in May, so that when people head off from work, they can have an extended weekend. I happen to think that was a mistake, because our summer season is now bookended by two extended weekends: Memorial Day to kick off the summer, and Labor Day at the end to close out the summer. And both of those days have been used for having barbecues and for inviting people over. Memorial Day, and you know, the tradition of laying the wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier is no longer on November 11th. It is now on Memorial Day, and has been for a long time. And I can't, you know, go to a store and buy a poppy this time of year. They're sold around Memorial Day. And broadly speaking, red flowers, not only just poppies. It's sort of morphed into this red flower, but poppy is still a thing. And so, yeah, I think it undervalued or devalued the holiday because it's on this long weekend that kicks off the summer. Now, that's not to say that people here in the United States ignore it. That's not true at all. People treat it very solemnly. And the tradition of decorating graves is still one of those traditions. And, you know, you'll go to a national cemetery and you'll see the flags put all over the graves, and people put flowers, and people bring wreaths, and they have parades. You know, it is very much treated solemnly. But by that afternoon, a lot of people are having barbecues. And frankly, you know, some people just don't pay enough attention to it because they're excited by making their weekend plans around this long weekend. So my view is it was a mistake to do that. I think they should have left it on the 31st of May. Let it fall during the week. Let it fall on whatever day it falls on, and let's not be distracted by this long holiday weekend. That's my personal viewpoint. And the fact that these 2 days are now separate also maybe distracts from them, because if they were all part of one day, maybe there would be a little bit less of a division of attention between the two. Having said that, it is nice to have a day for our veterans, for celebrating the living veterans and those living and those who are no longer with us. And I have, you know, I've never served in the military, but as I mentioned, I have a great uncle that was in World War I, obviously died many, many years before I was born. My maternal grandfather served in France in World War II in an infantry division of the U.S. Army called the Black Panther Division. And this is his patch. These are his dog tags and his sergeant stripes. I know that the Black Panther unit, from researching this long after my grandfather was dead, was heavily involved in sweep up of German pockets of resistance in 1944 and into 1945, where the Allies had already pushed into Germany. There were places in which there were still Germans, and you know, famously the Canadians went in and liberated the Netherlands, and I'm going to be doing a video on that in the not too distant future. And my grandfather's division liberated places in northern France that had still been under German occupation. And so I think of my grandfather today. I think of my father, who served in NATO in the late 1960s in Europe. The Vietnam War was raging. He was lucky enough to be assigned to Europe. He was in Army intelligence. And to this day, he won't tell me what he did. He keeps his oath because he's a man of honor. But I think of him and his service today. And I think of the service of all veterans, living and dead, in all of our nations that help us have what we have here and enjoy the lives that we have. So I view Veterans Day as a form of Remembrance Day. Remembrance of those who are still with us, those who have died, even if they didn't die in combat, and of course those who have died in combat. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly. Sacred herd amid the guns below, we are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunsets glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. So I think that's the wrap up for today, and it will also wrap up my segment on Remembrance Day. I'm gonna, it was, to me, it was well worth doing. I feel really positive about having done it. But I'm gonna get to something more cultural and lighthearted very soon, so that we can shift gears a little bit now that Remembrance Day is concluded. And that concludes this video, and I thank you so much for participating, for watching, for commenting, and just for being the most wonderful people out there. Peace and love from New York. Take care.